Think about the heart of almost any Muslim community globally. You'll often find a mosque, a masjid, standing right there. It's more than just a place for prayer, isn't it? It's really a vital center.
Absolutely. A true nucleus.
And today on the deep dive, we're really getting into the architecture of these essential buildings. We're focusing specifically on mosque design in Bangladesh using some pretty interesting research.
Yeah, and what's quite useful about this research is it's, let's say, tight focus.
Yeah.
We're not trying to cover everything, the schools or shops that are sometimes a part of a larger complex.
Right.
Instead, this deep dive really hones in on the design principles, the standards that directly impact how salat, the daily prayers, are performed, and the facilities immediately tied to that.
So things like the prayer direction,
Yeah.
the layout for worship, for washing, the really fundamental stuff.
Exactly, the core elements that make a mosque function for its primary purpose.
And even though we're looking at Bangladesh, these core ideas behind mosque, design, the mix of practical needs and, well, deep theological ideas, they resonate everywhere, don't they?
They really do. It's universal in many ways.
So whether you're maybe involved in planning a mosque or just fascinated by these spaces that mean so much to so many people, hopefully this will give you some real understanding. Okay, so where do we start? Maybe right at the beginning.
That's the best place. To really get a handle on mosque architecture now, we kind of need to look back at its origins.
Okay.
The very first mosque, the one the Prophet, peace be upon him, established in Medina, it was remarkably simple.
Simple how?
Well, austere, really functional. Its main job was, fulfilling God's commands, getting the message out, and serving that early Muslim community. Very direct, no frills.
Right, a stark contrast to some of the, let's say, grander, more ornate mosques we might picture today.
Exactly. And that's where it gets interesting. As Islam spread, geographically, culturally, mosque architecture inevitably started picking up influences from other religious building traditions in those areas.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
So that explains the move towards more monumental structures, sometimes quite lavish ones.
Precisely. And a key thing this research does is explore that shift. It tries to pinpoint that original sort of unadorned purpose of the mosque,
Okay.
and then track how that core idea got redefined, adapted, across different regions and through time. It makes you think about what's truly essential, the non-negotiables dictated by Sharia, by Islamic law.
And what are those essentials? What design criteria come directly from Sharia?
There are several really fundamental ones. First and foremost, obviously, is figuring out the Qibla direction.
Towards Mecca, the Kaaba.
Exactly, the precise orientation, that's absolutely crucial for salat. Then you've got the actual configuration of the spaces, the prayer hall layout, the areas for ablution or wuzu.
The ritual washing.
Right, and other necessary functions, the flow between them.
Okay, so Qibla direction, space layout, what else?
Another big one is supporting Jama. That's the congregational prayer. How does the design ensure that sense of unity continues, even if the mosque has multiple floors?
Ah, so people on different levels still feel connected in prayer.
Exactly. The design needs to facilitate that. And kind of linked to that, Sharia also guides the provision of the necessary service facilities, especially access to clean water for purification, tahara, which is, essential before prayer.
So those are the faith-based pillars. How do architects take those principles and, well, turn them into actual blueprints and buildings?
Right, that's the challenge. And that's where quantitative design standards come in. Sharia gives the why and the what, but architects need the how much, the concrete, measurable tools.
Okay.
This research really stresses how vital these standards are for making sure mosques actually work well, that they can serve the community effectively.
So what kind of practical issues do these standards actually tackle? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Think about calculating the capacity. How many people can comfortably pray in a given area? That involves looking at the spacing of the qatars.
The rows for prayer.
Exactly, the rows. And also ergonomic data. How much space does a person actually need when they're standing, when they're bowing? That's ruku or prostrating sujud.
Ah, the different postures during prayer.
Right. You need enough room for each. Then there are just basic space requirements for other activities, figuring out the right size for entrances and exits so you don't get dangerous crowding.
Especially after big prayers, I imagine.
Definitely. And even things like estimating the load on services, like how much water will be needed for wuzu at peak times.
So it's really drilling down into the practicalities. It's not just aesthetics. It's about making the experience smooth, functional, and respectful for everyone.
Precisely. And it's important to remember, as the research points out, the mosque's role often goes way beyond just the 5 daily
Oh,
prayers.
absolutely. I know they're often hubs for lots of different activity.
They really are. Things like dawah, which is not just outreach to non-Muslims, but also internal education and community building,
Okay.
religious classes for kids and adults, discussions about faith, community issues, sometimes even marriage ceremonies, social support services. A lot can happen there.
So it's a real anchor point for the community's social and spiritual life.
It truly is. The research highlights how the mosque helps establish that social identity, fosters a sense of belonging and self-esteem. That deep, all-encompassing involvement in a Muslim's life really underlines why thoughtful design is so important.
Okay, beyond the practical and community aspects,
Mhm.
are there common architectural features that we tend to associate with mosques? Things you see repeated?
Yes, definitely. Several key features have become sort of hallmarks globally. The most fundamental, as we said, is that clear orientation towards the Qibla. That's non-negotiable.
Right.
But beyond that, mosques often use specific architectural tricks, you could say, to mark the transition
Transition from what to what?
from the everyday secular world outside to the sacred spiritual space inside.
Ah, okay. Like what kind of features?
Well, it could be grand entrances, maybe a change in flooring material as you step inside, the way courtyards are used, or even how light is managed to create a different atmosphere in the prayer hall. There's often a conscious effort to evoke a sense of reverence.
Interesting. And the research mentioned a comparison someone made, P. Brown.
Yeah, P. Brown contrasted the typical clarity and openness of mosque spaces with, say, the often more intricate, sometimes hidden or mysterious nature of temples and other traditions.
How so? What's the difference?
Mosques often feature open courtyards, clear sightlines, a feeling of spaciousness. The focus is very direct, the worshipper facing the Qibla. Brown suggested this reflects a certain theological outlook.
As opposed to temples, which might be more enclosed.
Sometimes, yes. Maybe focusing on a central shrine that isn't immediately visible, more complex layouts, even the lack of figurative art in traditional Islamic decoration, compared to the imagery common in many temples, contributes to that distinct feel. Clarity and openness are often key.
Fascinating how design choices can reflect core beliefs. Speaking of beliefs, what do the foundational texts, the Quran and the Hadith, the Prophet's sayings and traditions tell us about mosques?
Well, the Quran has several verses that are really relevant. For instance, Surah Al-Araf mentions the importance of looking presentable, wearing your best when you come to pray. Surah Al-Baqarah speaks strongly against preventing people from remembering God in places of worship. And Surah At-Tawbah says basically that mosques should be maintained by true believers. So the Quran really emphasizes their sanctity, their purpose, and the right conduct within them.
Powerful reminders of their role.
Yeah.
What about the Hadith?
The Hadith add another layer. There's a very well-known one stating that praying in congregation in Jama is many times more rewarding than praying alone.
Right, emphasizing the community aspect.
Exactly. Other Hadith encourage praying together whenever possible, reinforcing the mosque as the ideal place for communal worship.
And I know some specific mosques hold extra significance.
Absolutely. The 3 holy mosques, Masjid al-Haram in Makkah, Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, are mentioned in Hadith as having exceptional merit. Praying there carries a vastly increased reward. There's even a Hadith that mentions the Kaaba in Makkah as the first house of worship established on earth, followed 40 years later by Al-Aqsa. That historical lineage really underlines their importance.
40 years. Wow, that's quite a gap. This scriptural and historical background really sets the scene. Let's go back to that very first mosque in Medina. What did it actually look like? You said simple.
Very simple, very practical.
Uh-huh.
Imagine a roughly square, open courtyard, enclosed by basic walls, maybe mud brick, 3 entrances
Okay.
on the northern side, because initially they prayed towards Jerusalem. There was a covered portico, just a roofed area for shelter during prayer.
Like a simple prayer hole.
Exactly. And then attached were 2 small rooms, basic living quarters for the Prophet's family, and another smaller covered area, the Safa, for poor migrants who needed shelter. Very integrated into daily life.
Really functional.
Yeah.
How did it change over time? Did it stay that simple?
Well, the materials evolved. Initially, it was things like sun-dried bricks, date palm trunks for pillars, palm leaves for roofing, basic local stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Later, during the time of the early caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, as the community grew and resources increased, there were expansions. They started using more durable materials, engraved stone, teak wood. But the fundamental layout, that open courtyard with a covered prayer area, remained the core concept for quite some time.
It's amazing to think about that evolution from such humble beginnings. And its status now, of course.
Yes, the Prophet's Mosque in Medina is now the second holiest site in Islam, after the Kaaba itself. It underwent major reconstruction later, but that original site holds immense significance.
Okay, so we have these foundational principles, the scriptural basis, the historical example. How do regional factors then start to shape things?
Well, climate is a big one, obviously, and local customs, available materials, it's just inevitable, isn't it?
Sure.
For example, the research mentions mosques in colder places, like Azerbaijan, tend to be more enclosed to keep the heat in during winter, whereas in warmer climates, you see much more emphasis on open courtyards for air circulation.
Makes perfect sense. Adaptation. What about the shape of the prayer hall itself? Does that vary much?
The core need for salat standing in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder, facing the Qibla, really pushes the design towards simple geometric shapes.
Like squares or rectangles?
Exactly. Those make it easiest to form neat, straight rows parallel to the Qibla wall. You don't really see circular or oddly shaped prayer halls because it makes lining up difficult. In Bengal, for instance, the historical mosques often fall into these rectangular or square categories.
You mentioned a specific example from Bengal earlier, the Chodosona Mosque. What does that tell us about regional style?
Oh, yes, the Chodosona Mosque from around the late 15th, early 16th century. It's a fascinating example of this blend. It has the rectangular prayer hall, multiple aisles inside, created by stone pillars.
Okay.
But then you see distinct local touches. The roof uses domes, yes, but also incorporates the Bengali chotala roof style, that curved shape you see on traditional huts, adapted for a grander building.
Ah, interesting, like a local architectural signature.
Exactly. And the material's too brick, faced with beautifully carved stone, often basalt. The style of carving sometimes recalls the terracotta art that was very common in the region. So it's clearly a mosque, following Islamic principles, but speaking a local architectural language.
That fusion is really key. Now, this research we're drawing on, it included a field study in Bangladesh, right? Looking at mosques on the ground.
Yes, they surveyed a range of mosques across different areas in Bangladesh.
And what did they find? Any key takeaways from actually seeing these spaces?
A couple interesting things stood out. One was, perhaps surprisingly, there wasn't a huge difference in the basic layout, the form, or even the materials used between mosques in, say, major urban centers and those in more rural areas.
Really, you might expect more contrast.
You might. The main difference they noted sometimes was the water source for wazoo, maybe a pond in a rural setting versus taps in the city, but the fundamental articulation of space was often quite similar.
Okay, so not massive urban-rural divides in basic design. What did vary?
What did show significant variation was how the mosque space was used, and that depended heavily on the type of area it was in its catchment area.
Meaning like residential versus commercial.
Exactly. Is it mainly serving residents, office workers, shoppers, people near a market or a school? The patterns of use, the peak times, the specific needs, those varied a lot.
And did mosques in similar types of areas show similarities?
Yes, that was another key finding. Mosques located in, say, similar commercial districts tended to have similar features and usage patterns, even if they were in completely different administrative regions, different xilas. So the immediate local context, the type of community served, seemed more influential than broader regional factors within Bangladesh.
That makes a lot of sense. Form follows function, or at least usage patterns. Did the field study identify any common problems or challenges in these mosques?
It did. Several practical issues came up repeatedly. Things like entrances and stairways being too narrow or poorly designed, leading to congestion, especially after Friday prayers or during festivals.
Yeah, I can picture that.
Also, wazir facilities often being insufficient for peak times, meaning long waits. And related to that, sometimes significant water wastage from taps left running during the washing ritual.
Resource management issues, too.
Right. And in some of the older historical mosques, architectural features that are part of their heritage sometimes create modern problems like domes causing acoustic issues, echoes, or rows of closely spaced columns obstructing views and movement, structural limitations of the past impacting present use.
These are really down-to-earth, practical things that affect the worshiper's experience every day. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the overall design approach. What are some of the most basic considerations when planning a mosque?
Location, 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 just like in real estate. The research really emphasizes this. Ideally, a mosque should be centrally placed within the community it
Oh,
serves.
it's central.
For equal access, really. Equidistant as much as possible so people can reach it easily and in time for the congregational prayers. Sell it.
Accessibility seems crucial then.
Absolutely. And accessibility in another sense, too. The principle is that a mosque is the house of Allah. No Muslim who is mentally sound and in a state of ritual purity, tahara, should be forbidden entry.
So access shouldn't be restricted?
Ideally, no. The research points out potential issues, for example, if a mosque is located within a restricted compound like a government building mentioned in the Bangladesh context. That might prevent the general public from accessing it freely, which goes against the inclusive spirit. Careful site selection is key to avoid that.
That's a really important point about inclusivity. Now, what about the Qibla orientation? We know it's fundamental, but how is it actually determined accurately? It's not just face west everywhere, is it?
Definitely not. That's a common misconception, especially in places like Bangladesh, where west is roughly the direction. But for true accuracy, it requires calculation.
How was it done traditionally versus now?
Traditionally, people might have used compasses, relied on observations of the sun or stars, or followed the direction of established mosques. But Muslim scholars, going back centuries, developed sophisticated methods.
Really, there's a history of calculating the Qibla.
Oh yes, a rich history. Early Muslim astronomers and mathematicians, names like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Battani, Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Biruni, made huge contributions. They developed methods using spherical trigonometry, treating the Earth as a sphere, to calculate the precise direction from any point to the Kaaba.
Wow. That's serious science meeting faith.
It really is. They understood the geometry involved, and this dedication to accuracy just shows how important getting the Qibla right was considered.
So how is it done today with modern tech?
Today, it's much easier, of course. We have satellite surveys, GPS coordinates, online calculators. You can get incredibly precise bearings using spherical trigonometry formulas, plugging in the exact latitude and longitude of the mosque location and the Kaaba.
The research actually mentions the formula.
Yes, it presents the mathematical basis using spherical geometry and gives the formula explaining the inputs needed, the latitudes and longitudes. It even walks through an example calculation for Dhaka, so it gets quite technical, but the principle is sound geometry.
Incredible precision. It's far more than just a general direction.
It is. And while we have modern tools, the research also notes other historical methods people used: graphical charts, observing shadows at specific times, specialized instruments called Qibla indicators. Lots of ingenuity went into this over the centuries.
What about that west is close enough idea for places like Bangladesh? How does the research address that?
It acknowledges that this approximation is common, but points out it's not perfectly accurate. However, it also brings in the perspective of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh,
Which says,
which generally allows for some flexibility, maybe up to 45 degrees deviation, if correcting the direction in an existing mosque would cause major difficulty or disruption.
okay, a practical concession.
Right. The key is avoiding unnecessary disputes or divisions within the community over small inaccuracies in older buildings. Strive for accuracy in new ones, absolutely, but don't let excessive rigidity cause conflict. Unity is also paramount.
That's a really pragmatic and balanced view.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dig into the functional design now.
Yeah.
Zoning, how does that work in a mosque?
It's pretty fundamental. You basically have your served spaces, the areas primarily for worship, like the main prayer hall, any verandas or courtyards used for prayer, and then your service spaces entrances. Wazoo areas, toilets, maybe storage, admin offices, stairwells, circulation paths.
Makes sense. Served in service.
And there's another crucial zoning layer: shoe versus no-shoe zones. The prayer areas are sacred, kept clean, so shoes are removed before entering. Toilets and general entrance areas would be shoe zones. Maintaining that clear separation is vital for cleanliness and respect.
Right, preserving the sanctity of the prayer space. What about the Wazoo area specifically, the place for ritual washing?
Super important. Remember, tahara, being ritually pure, is obligatory wajib before salat, so the Wazoo facility has to be adequate and accessible.
Are there specific design guidelines for it?
Yes. Islamic tradition suggests, if possible, facing the Qibla during Wazoo and maybe sitting on a slightly raised platform. Crucially, the research highlights the need to separate the Wazoo khana, the washing place itself, from the toilets.
Why the separation?
Because the Wazoo area is considered part of the preparation for prayer, a more sacred act. Toilets are functionally necessary, but considered ritually profane. Separating them allows for reciting specific supplications, dua, related to wazu, without being in the vicinity of the toilet.
Okay, maintaining ritual boundaries. What types of wazoo setups did the study find?
All sorts. Traditional ponds, especially in rural areas, piped water systems with various tap designs, individual taps, troughs with multiple taps. Sometimes just water collected in pots if supply is unreliable. There are even Sharia guidelines about the minimum volume for a water reservoir if it's a large basin to ensure the water remains pure.
And bathing facilities.
They should generally be enclosed for privacy unless there's absolutely no other option.
Got it. What about the toilets themselves? Any specific considerations beyond separation?
Well, their profane nature means certain things are avoided inside reciting Quran, making dua, mentioning Allah's name. There are specific short prayers recommended for entering and leaving the toilet, so the design should clearly demarcate the toilet area as distinct.
Another practical headache must be shoes. Everyone takes them off. Where do they go?
Yeah, shoe storage is often a challenge. The research mentions a few methods. Sometimes there's an attendant who collects them, but that can create bottlenecks.
I can imagine.
A very common way, especially in Bangladesh it seems, is for people to just place their shoes on a small piece of cloth or newspaper in front of them near the edge of the prayer row.
Does that work well?
It can have drawbacks. Sometimes shoes are damp or dirty, which can affect the prayer mat or floor. It can also potentially Finding a good, organized, clean solution is tricky. Maybe dedicated shelves near the entrance.
We'll come back to shelves, perhaps. What about the mihrab, that niche in the Qibla wall?
The mihrab primarily acts as the visual marker, confirming the Qibla direction for the imam and congregation. Ideally, it should be right in the middle of the Qibla wall.
Always in the middle.
Ideally. Those slight shifts might be unavoidable due to structural columns or site shape. For multi-story mosques, the main indispensable mihrab should really be on the ground floor where the imam usually leads. Optional ones can be added on upper floors, mainly for visual alignment.
Okay. And the main prayer space, the Salat Hall itself, any recommendations for its shape or proportions?
If there are no site constraints forcing a different shape, the research suggests a rectangle can be very efficient, maybe with a width to length proportion of around 1.2.
Why that ratio?
It relates partly to visibility. For things like sermons or talks, there's an optimal range, maybe around 15 meters for people at the back to see and hear clearly without strain. So that suggests a preferred maximum width, perhaps leading to a longer, narrower hall to accommodate more rows effectively. The research even gets into formulas for calculating dimensions based on capacity.
Wow, okay, so even the shape is optimized. Let's talk aesthetics. How does Islam influence the look and feel, the symbolism?
Islam has always been a powerful inspiration for architects and artists. In mosque architecture, a key principle is the general avoidance of depicting humans or animals, figural representation.
Right, no statues or paintings of people.
Exactly. Instead, the emphasis is on other forms of beauty and symbolism.
Such as?
You can think of it in two categories. First, the architectural elements themselves often take on symbolic, meaning the mihrab pointing the way, the dome representing the heavens, arches creating elegant transitions, the minaret calling to prayer. Even if technology makes a minaret technically redundant for the call to prayer now, these features have become such strong identity markers for a mosque.
They're instantly recognizable, like visual shorthand.
Absolutely. And the second category is decoration. Mosques often feature stunningly intricate calligraphy, usually verses from the Quran or historical inscriptions, and complex geometric patterns or stylized floral and vegetable designs known as arabesque. These appear in tile work, carved plaster or wood, latticework screens, painted surfaces. The early mosques in Bengal, for instance, are famous for their beautiful terracotta tile decorations.
So a very rich visual tradition, just expressed through geometry, calligraphy, and pattern rather than figures. Now, bringing it back to the specific context of Bangladesh climate, what are the key challenges there?
Bangladesh has a warm, humid, tropical climate. You've got distinct seasons, a cool, dry winter, a hot, dry pre-monsoon, and then the long, hot, wet monsoon and post-monsoon period. High temperatures and high humidity are major factors for much of the year.
So comfort is a big issue. How do architects deal with that? Ventilation must be key.
Hugely important. Good ventilation is needed for health, obviously fresh air, but also crucially for thermal comfort, trying to get some air movement to cool people down. And it even helps protect the building itself by reducing dampness and mold growth.
Is there a standard for how much ventilation is needed?
The research suggests looking at standards for similar activity levels. Prayer is mostly sedentary, so it proposes a minimum fresh air exchange rate, maybe similar to what you'd aim for in a living room, perhaps 1 air change per hour as a baseline, though natural cross-ventilation would ideally provide much more in that climate.
Okay. What about sound, acoustics? Large halls, maybe domes. It sounds like a recipe for echoes.
It certainly can be. Acoustics need careful thought. A basic rule of thumb is to try and avoid large, parallel, hard surfaces facing each other, especially if they're more than about 17 meters apart, as that can cause noticeable echo.
So how do you manage that in a big mosque?
You can use sound-absorbing materials on some surfaces, carpets, wall hangings, special acoustic panels, or deliberately design walls or ceilings that aren't parallel to break up the sound waves. Domes are notoriously tricky. Their curved shape can focus sound in undesirable ways, so the curvature and any acoustic treatment inside the dome need careful design.
Lots to consider for a comfortable prayer environment. Any other quick design points to mention?
Just a few. Careful handling of any steps or level changes within the main prayer area is important to avoid breaking the continuity of the prayer rows, courtyards, which has implications in Sharia.
Right, keep the rows continuous.
Also, really thinking about the size, number, and placement of doors, stairs, and corridors to handle the flow of people smoothly and prevent jams.
Circulation.
Exactly. And finally, a general principle of austerity or moderation in choosing materials and finishes, thinking about durability, maintenance, life cycle cost, not just initial appearance. The research even gives some guidelines on where ornamentation is more or less appropriate, maybe more on the exterior, less on the lower interior walls where people pray.
Okay, a really holistic approach. Now, the research culminates in proposing specific design standards, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Chapter 6.
Yes, that chapter tries to consolidate the findings into practical, usable standards. It borrows a framework, maybe inspired by things like time-saver standards, and proposes levels: minimum, good, and excellent.
And these are specifically for Bangladesh.
Crucially, yes. The data, especially the measurements related to people's size and space needs, is based on anthropometric research on the Bangladeshi population. The standards also consider local resources, climate, and typical mosque activities in that context. They aren't meant to be universal, but tailored.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Can you give us a flavor of what these standards cover? Some examples.
Sure. Let's take capacity determination. How big does the mosque need to be?
Okay.
The research offers formulas to estimate this based on the population in the neighborhood, the percentage likely to be Muslim, the percentage of those likely to pray regularly, and even suggesting different peak times depending on the area, like Maghrib prayer might be busiest in a residential or market area, while Zuhr might be the peak in an office district.
So tailoring capacity to expected demand. What about the actual space needed per person for prayer?
This is where the anthropometric data comes in. They provide specific dimensions: net space, clearance space, gross space needed for an individual Muzali worshiper in the key postures: standing, bowing, ruku, and prostrating, sujud. These dimensions are statistically derived, offering minimum, good, mean plus standard deviations, and excellent options.
Very precise. What else? Sitting space. Wazoo space.
Yes, dimensions for sitting cross-legged or other postures, often used during talks or Quran reading. For wazoo, it gives suggestions for widths needed at pawn steps, and detailed dimensions for tap-based facilities: platform height, spacing between taps, circulation room, again, with minimum, good, excellent variations.
How about toilets? How many are needed?
It provides tables suggesting the space required per toilet unit, WC and ablution space, and then another table estimating how many units are needed per 100 worshippers, differentiating between neighborhood types because usage patterns vary. A market mosque might need more facilities for transient users than a purely residential one.
And circulation space, corridors, lobbies.
Yes, it suggests percentages for circulation space relative to the main salat area, again with the 3 standards, and distinguishing between spaces only for circulation versus areas like verandas that might serve a dual purpose.
What about getting people in and out safely? Egress.
That's critical. It references the Bangladesh National Building Code, BNBC, but actually proposes a new occupancy category specifically for salat space without any furniture, suggesting a floor area per person based on the prayer posture dimensions. This leads to recommendations for the required total exit width per occupant, again based on the BNBC methodology, but using this revised occupancy load. It also provides overall floor space estimates per person, including all services for different neighborhood types.
So really trying to refine safety calculations for this specific building type
Yeah.
configuration shoe shows.
Yes. Tables suggesting possible length, width, and height combinations for the main prayer hall based on the number of rows and the derived formulas. And detailed dimensions for different standards of shoe shelves and even umbrella stands thinking about practical storage needs.
It's incredibly thorough, really practical guidance. So to wrap up this deep dive, what's the final takeaway message about the mosque from this research? What's its essence?
I think the research really brings it back to the mosque's core role. A nucleus for inspiration, for unity, for brotherhood. That shared Qibla direction is a powerful symbol of the single ummah, the global community.
Mhm.
And its physical form should ideally reflect virtues like austerity, simplicity, clarity, and function. Site features matter, accurate Qibla matters.
But with that note of pragmatism for existing buildings.
Exactly. While striving for accuracy is important, especially in new constructions, the research also counsels against letting minor deviations in older mosques become sources of conflict, emphasizing unity and understanding. It's about balancing the ideal with practical compassion.
A really insightful balance. This exploration of mosque architecture, especially through the lens of Bangladesh, has certainly highlighted that complex, fascinating interplay between theology, practical human needs, and the local environment.
It really shows how much thought goes into shaping these spaces, doesn't it? How faith and function are so deeply intertwined in the design, right down to the dimensions needed for sujud, or the placement of a wazoo tap.
It definitely encourages you to look differently. Maybe the next time you visit or pass by a mosque, you'll see those design elements, the orientation, the layout, the dome, the arches, with a perhaps newfound appreciation for their purpose and the values they represent.
Hopefully. And if this has sparked your interest, we definitely encourage you to seek out the source material or related research for an even deeper understanding.